Too much box, not enough product, and way too many air pillows. Today, let's talk packaging. This is LeaderShipping. I'm Jeremy Lee. Good to have you here. Here's the thing about e-commerce. As it grows, so does the pile of packaging waste. So today we're asking, what if packaging got smarter? What if the box fit the product, cut waste, and saved money? And maybe even made customers happier? To unpack all of that, and yes, pun very much so intended, I got a chance to catch up with Cameron Stout, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Packsize, a company that's been making on-demand, right-sized packaging a reality. Let's listen in. Cameron, we're thrilled to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we dive in and I start grilling you with a bunch of questions, I want to start with something, just a little quick warm-up, something that we're calling our kickoff question. Sound fair?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. If you could eliminate one packaging-related pet peeve forever, either as a consumer or as a packaging pro, what would it be?
I'd have to say probably shipments in poly bags. By themselves, just one's not really the biggest deal, but just kind of the additive nature. A lot of people use them because they're very cheap, but it takes, I think, 1,000 years for them to decompose. And so just the additive effects of that really start to add up over time. And then, the other part is it's just kind of a cheap way to get an online product, right? Usually you're buying something you're excited about. For me, it's golf clothes. So, if I get something, from Travis Matthew or something like that, it comes in a poly bag. It just, doesn't feel special.
And they're always filthy too. Like you touch it and it's like your hands turn black because they've gone through conveyor belts and like been on the back of trucks and God knows where. I'm not a big fan of those things either. Everybody thought they were going to be a game changer when they first came out, and I don't know that's necessarily been the case. In fact, I've actually seen the opposite of that, where folks have ended up costing themselves a whole lot more money out there. I think if I was going to get rid of something, and this is like a double-edged sword, because again, like looking at like green and sustainability, like I want to be as efficient as possible, and some of these things are like that. But those airbags, and it usually happens when like the box is nowhere near the right shape or size for whatever's inside of it, and somebody just like pulled out like 1,000 of those little airbags and threw them in there, and I'm like, I know a lot of it, like some of them can be recycled, some of them can't, but like there's no good way to get rid of them. So I'm like outside in the driveway with like a, box cutter, like just trying to strip through like 1,000 of these little airbags. I'd rather just like take the brown paper and pack it around there maybe. I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it goes to the same place that the poly bags go. So
yeah,
1,000 years later, we can kiss them goodbye.
Hopefully. Well, that's awesome. Well, let's dive in a little bit more into the conversation. So, one of the main topics here that we're kind of looking at, or I should say maybe big picture, is, let's set the stage for the audience of like how big of a problem is packaging waste, like both for the environment, and in the eyes of the shopper themselves. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard stuff about like microplastics, like all sorts of things like that out there, but I mean, tell us a little bit about like how big do you see this problem?
Sure. Well, I think it's it is a massive problem that's only getting larger, right? Because the companies that are doing the right thing and trying to be more green and sustainable are kind of being still overrun by just the sheer volume of e-commerce shipments. The EPA estimates that packaging in and of itself creates 96 million tons of waste per year. So that of that, only 60 million tons do not get recycled. So if you can think about just a good visual for you is 5 million completely full garbage trucks worth of waste. And then if you've ever been to New York and you've seen the Empire State Building, imagine, if Wally built 164 Empire State Buildings full of waste, right? And that's year in and year out. So not only does that take a toll on the environment, right? And you mentioned at the start just microplastics and things like it's doing to our environment,
Hmm.
but it also does really cost, companies from just like a waste of money and overspending in the packaging materials that they need to,
Sure.
overspending in logistics costs, but it also really hurts our brand reputation. So, and back in 2021, we ran consecutive years of consumer, just non-biased kind of consumer surveys. And of the most frequent shoppers, 90% said that they cared about, improving environmental sustainability from the companies that they choose to shop with, right? So the people that are driving, this e-commerce growth are some of the most conscious because they should be, because they're seeing what shows up on their doorstep every single day, going through the yard's worth of packing material that they don't necessarily need, and most of them know that there's got to be a better way to do this.
Thinking about like 164 Empire State Buildings and like how that was, just a like engineering marvel at, in its time of like the biggest building ever built. Now let's fill it full of, waste and then, do that 164 more times. I mean, that's an entire city full of, waste. And I mean, you mentioned something like 60 tons or basically 2/3 of that packaging ultimately ends up becoming waste at the end, which is way more than what I would have originally thought. As far as like how we start to tackle this problem, like obviously shippers are familiar that there's a lot of hidden costs of like using the wrong sized packaging. My poor wife has to deal with my brain all the time of like living in this world and like seeing things that get delivered to our house, and I'm like, oh, look at this. And one that stands out to me was probably like right around the COVID time frame, and it was around Christmas, and I swear to you, this had to have been like a 4 foot by 3 foot box. Showed up and it weighed nothing. I opened it up and there was one roll of wrapping paper inside of it, like diagonal. Like whoever was in like the pick and pack at the store, like was just, I don't know. This is the only box we have that'll hold this. Here you go.
Probably did run out of boxes.
I was
A
like,
lot of people ran out of boxes during that time, for
can you
sure.
imagine the dim impact on this? So, understanding that there's hidden costs of like overpacking and everything, a lot of brands, don't realize how much oversized packaging is like hitting their bottom line. And how big of an impact is this? You and I see this type of stuff, but maybe you could walk us through, some of the biggest cost drivers that are out there.
Yeah. So, it's kind of Packsize's business to be able to quantify these kind of things, right? So, we've really put a lot of time and effort into understanding just what our average impact looks like. So, during every single one of our business cases, we'll take customers' actual data and we'll say, okay, how are you packaging things before? And how would you package them after? It is a simulation, so it's not perfect, but it's very close, especially when we've got an understanding of who the carrier is, kind of what things look like on the back end from a rate table perspective. So we can plug all those things in, and we decided that it was time to just aggregate all of that information and all of that data, and because we've got it for big customers, small customers. It's just a very widespread. So we analyze. I think the latest number I've seen is about 90 million orders, and what the average impact looks like is for that oversize that you're talking about, right? Whether that is an item that just has too much air, or whether it's just too long or too girthy, or it weighs too much. That dim weight is about 50 cents an order.
Okay.
They're overspending by 50 cents an order. For the filler that you were talking about, all those pillows, right? Those things are, those also are not cheap. 7 cents per order there. If you take a look at most warehouses, you'll go in and you'll just see a couple rows of static pallet rack that are just chock full of boxes, right?
Mhm.
Those are about $600 per pallet position per year. So that can add up quickly. And then packaging labor is just another big impact. If you're doing things correctly and if you're integrating, say, some other automation technologies, then you can expect to save about 40 cents an order just in actual packaging the products after you've picked them off of the shelf or off of the rack. So your total cost avoidance is about $1.10 per order. And you can see that starts to add up extremely fast, especially amongst high volume shippers.
People don't realize it. Like working in this industry, like it's a game of not even dollars, but like oftentimes cents, right? Like saving a few pennies here and there, like per shipment, really stacks up, especially if you're moving, tens of thousands or millions of units per year. It's oftentimes for your average person out there, like it's hard to fathom like how a minuscule change can really have such like a big impact. Even most folks don't understand like even dim weight. Like we throw out the acronyms of dim or dimensional weight, and the fact that you're talking about an industry that has like a finite amount of resources to move items from point A to point B.
Yep.
It's a fixed cost model out there, and so we've even got regulations for how much weight you can pull over a lot of roads. So anybody that's ever driven and said like, hey, max weight for this bridge is this amount, right? Like there's a lot of things that go into all of this, and so the carriers use a density based model that says like, hey, if you're I can carry this much weight and I have this much space and this is how much it costs me and I want to make this amount of money, and like they work into it. But if you're dropping chapstick into a shoebox, like you're wasting a lot of space and a lot of weight that carrier could be optimizing or be using to pull over the road, and so they've got to make up some of that gap. So
Absolutely. No, and I think that was a great explanation. And these problems and this expense is only going to get higher over time.
That's right. And like, I mean, your systems are, and we'll talk about this here in just a few minutes, but like, I mean, your systems are, large, they're robust, they're very sophisticated and everything. They're not a fit for, your mom and pop shop that's just getting going necessarily. They could be, right?
Yeah.
But like, it's a significant investment, right? Like you have to understand like where you're going as a business and in order to get one of those things in there. And so, that's where, our two organizations have come together in many instances. And you mentioned something that's really important is that like, no, we're not adversaries with the carriers, right? Like we're actually out here helping, companies not put that chapstick into a shoebox, right? And identifying how they can be more efficient and more cost effective, allowing them to have more capital or free revenue to, scale that business, but also not become, that I don't want to call it blacklisted, but like less desirable account that the carriers might have. But they're like, well, I don't want to work with you, and have some of those disincentives out there. But it's not to punish shippers as much as it is like, hey, we've all got to be responsible. We're all playing a part in this broader game here.
Absolutely.
So, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, how does all of this stuff like impact, e-commerce differently than maybe like a business to business type, like transaction, if you will?
Sure. I think the easiest way to think about like when Packsize can have the greatest impact is when you see the greatest amount of SKU diversity, right? Which a lot of e-com does, right? So your average lines per order are up, but then also the average shape, size, and kind of composition of these orders looks very different, right? Especially, if it's kind of a a marketplace retailer, for example, right? Like, Amazon or Walmart, you might have, you just got customers that are shopping for very random things that you try to put together in a box. And that's when things become very difficult to do. So, when you've got that wider variety of SKUs, and usually that's coupled with higher throughput requirements, then that's where our impact can, really be felt on, the dim weight that we already talked about, right? Because we are putting actual like thought and analytics, and we're digesting the order profile and creating the right size box because of it. And so, overall, like when you pair those up, you require more labor to actually fulfill your orders. You've got a much harder kind of Rubik's cube problem to solve. And we really can help e-commerce customers do that, in a software-driven kind of systematic way that can benefit, not only day one, but then also just many years down the road, and plus plus the sustainability impact, which can't be understated and matters more and more, now than it ever has been. So,
and for folks that might not like be able to even conceptualize that, like one way that I think you use this example in there, like think about Amazon or, I'm sure everybody's gone into like a Walmart or a Target at some point in their life, but imagine trying to stock like standard box sizes to ship every single different item that's inside of like that store.
yeah.
There's no way, right? And like you mentioned, like, warehouse space and, pallet space and everything like that, like how much like you would basically have an entire warehouse taken up of just different box sizes if you were trying to be absolutely efficient. And so what gives is, you try to settle on like 10 or 20 different box sizes, knowing that there's going to be waste inside of there.
Yep.
Hoping that you can minimize that waste, and it usually doesn't work that well.
Yeah, and the other part, just because you made a good point, right? Is that these box making decisions or these box procurement decisions, they get compounded in in an e-commerce environment because you've also got the speed aspect, right? So if you're trying to tie into some more automated equipment, you're just trying to move fast. A lot of times they'll just say, you know what, instead of 10, we need speed, so we're going to use 3, right? So maybe 10 was the best decision if you're looking at everything from end to end, but your operations team is looking at it and saying, okay, well, those 10 take too much time to make. I need them to be made in an automated fashion, right? And I need them to be made as quickly as possible. And, the older way of doing it was with carton erectors, where you just put a big magazine of lay flat boxes, and then they would erect them, and you could fire those things off. It's very fast. That equipment is very reliable, but then, if I see those, then that's usually when I get the most excited when I walk into a facility, because I know that they're putting very little effort into the actual right sizing of it. And we can kind of, give them their cake and eat it too. They can still move fast. Our equipment is much quicker than it ever has been, since I've been at Packsize for roughly 8 years. Our equipment is on the high end is 4 times faster than we used to be able to move. So, all these things kind of just add up, but it's a tough problem to solve if you're just trying to kind of cherry pick cost drivers within it.
100%. And then like actually getting like the good data to even start with to understand like how big your problem is, depending on how robust or how clean your operations process is, you might not even have like a good foundation to understand, because you could be having folks that are just putting in like, dimensions that are like 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch, and it weighs 1 pound, right? And you're like shipping out an anvil. They're just plugging in the number because it requires me to do something, or
Sure.
Your ERP isn't set up to do that type of stuff. And so they look at it, and we have conversations with folks like that all the time, and it's like, let's get clean data in so then we can start making clean decisions on the backside over there. And, here's where we need to start. I think the analogy that I use is, I've got little kids, and I'm always like, they're like, we need more space. I need a bigger closet. Like, well, let's hold on. Like, maybe we should clean our room before we start talking. Like, I need a bigger closet, or I need more space, right? Like, maybe there's some waste in here. Like, let's get that good data in.
Yeah.
So, Packsize's mission and solution. Let's talk a little bit about how Packsize is, helping solve a lot of these problems that we've kind of touched on. What is the core idea behind, on-demand, right-sized packaging?
Sure. So the most simple way to explain it, is that rather than buying boxes from a local box supplier, we would supply you with a machine, like some of the ones that you can see behind me. With those, they will take data, usually from a customer's WMS, or there's manual ways to do it. It just depends on how integrated you want to get with it. And we will analyze the order profile. So it's a game of Tetris that takes place where we say, okay, you've got product A, B, and C. We're going to move those around in space in a 3D manner to say this is the best size package that this should be shipped in, right? If the product is fragile or has some other considerations, we can also consider those too, right? So if there's a hazmat type of item that's going to go out, or a very fragile item, we can add buffers to those things, right? So we're not saying, okay, it's going to be on demand and it's just the box and that's all that we worry about. And if you get the box right, then you've got the whole recipe right. That's not necessarily the case. It's like, what are you shipping? How are you shipping it? Let's tie it into your WMS. And then they will send orders to our equipment. Our equipment will cut the right size box out of Z-fold corrugated. So it's basically like an accordion full of corrugated. And all you need to do is just focus on making sure that that machine remains running and that it's stocked with corrugated, and you can go all day.
Wow. I've seen your machines in action. They're really impressive. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how the tech works. You kind of touched on some of this stuff, and I know over here at Sifted, we're usually diagnosing the problem and giving operational solutions to folks, and it's like, okay, we can do so much, and then our recommendation becomes hey, you need to start having conversations with someone like a Packsize that does this right size packaging.
Yep.
Because maybe the solutions that or the hypotheticals that we've run aren't feasible, or it's hey, we're now getting into that category of having to have too many different boxes out here, so I need some tech out there, right? So
Yep.
Maybe you could just go a little bit deeper on how all of that stuff works.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think first is just recognizing that you've got a problem, and that's where a company like Sifted comes in, right? Is that you guys are able to identify the problem and identify just the wasted spend. So you can identify and say, here are the dollars that are at risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with that, that's kind of where, we will come in and, we'll really decide first, just what kind of process flow do you want? Do you want something that's got an onboard dimensioning system where, maybe you don't have dimensions of your product, right? You talked about, bad data in, bad data out. Well,
Sure.
If you don't have any data, then that's kind of your worst case scenario. But luckily, there are many, many different technologies, including ours, that can solve that problem. That is the most common, I think, when people think on-demand packaging, they think of those kind of machines where just run it through a dimensioning gate that will communicate to the machine, and usually the corrugated gets wrapped around the product, right? So that's great for a good amount of types of products, right? Like shoes and apparel, for example, right?
Sure.
Great fit for those. You don't need to worry about any kind of fragility. You don't need to worry about liquids. You don't need to worry about any of those things because you really can't ship them effectively if they are fragile, if they are liquid, if they are these things, because
Mm-hmm.
you're running it through an automated piece of equipment and you can't add any void fill or any kind of protection, right? So it's also, it doesn't give you the maximum labor impact. So another way it will happen is if you decide to go box first, where you're creating, what we call box first is you create the shipper before you actually pick the order, right? So you would put those onto a bot or you'd put them onto some conveyor, and then you would actually grab items off of the shelf and then pick them into the shipping carton. When you do that, you can think about the diversity of your SKUs. You can protect the ones that need to be protected. You can fully right size just, down as tight as you can get it, as practically as you can get it to still be able to package into the actual box itself. And then, that will go down the line. You can add some void fill or whatever you need and close up the box and send it out. So, those are kind of the two biggest pathways.
Okay.
But another, key aspect to a lot of this is that you're cartonizing correctly, right? So do you know what cartonization technology is?
I am familiar with it, but maybe for anyone listening, that like you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So cartonization, when I was talking about the game of Tetris earlier, when you're trying to pair, 4, 5, 6, 7 different SKUs that have different shapes and different sizes and different weights, cartonization is basically like the world's best Tetris player. And the reason why this matters is that, if you are going to pick to that shipping carton, getting cartonization and doing it well is extremely important because there's a lot of old technology that exists out there that is what's called liquid fill, where it basically just takes a look at the volume of something and says, okay, here's the volume of this and the volume of this. And that's great if you're shipping cans of paint. It really starts to fall down if you're thinking about the volume of a yardstick. Right. So 3D cartonization is something that we're invested in, and we're partnered with Packard because of it, because they have the best 3D cartonization engine that thinks about all the different types of SKUs and can account for all the variation. So, when you're doing that, you're getting the right math done to tell our machines this is the right size box you need to create. But if you miss on that step, you're probably just still not right sizing as best as you can.
And that's ironically this morning we had an internal meeting because a client had reached out, and that's exactly what they wanted to talk about. And ironically, I used a very similar analogy to what you used right there, as far as like Tetris. I was like, I don't have an auto Tetris generator over here now. Can I solve the problems mathematically? Yes, but is it a scalable solution? No, and that's where we turn to folks like yourselves that are experts in that space. And ultimately, what they were doing is saying, "Hey, we know that we have a dim problem, okay, but we want to understand what we need to do, and we have 1,000 different SKUs or something, right? Like I'm just using a hypothetical here, and it's like." I was like, even if I do sum up all the different volumes and say, hey, you have to have minimum lengths and widths of this based on the dimensions of the different SKUs that are going in there, there's no way that I could come back to you with an actual answer that says these are the boxes that you should have. In that situation, you 100% need to invest in the technology that is going to be able to grow and scale and adjust with you as your market adjusts as well. And it was really interesting to kind of think about that first thing in the morning. Like let's go complex, like super Tetris here right now. But it is what it is, and that's why we all work so well together, because we all solve very complex problems, but a different piece of that problem. So when you put us all together, that's where you get end-to-end solutions completely taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then the other cool part about that is that with that, you Sifted is going to identify just what does accessorials look like, right? Where are you going overweight? And that's kind of where that combination of that software and hardware that I talked about can help those, because you can hard code it. You can say, unless it's physically impossible to ship this item, never make the box that is going to trigger an oversize. And then we're also able to split things up and say, okay, you have 2 items that are 30 pounds a piece. Put them into one box, accessorial. Put them into 2 boxes. Yeah, are you increasing your overall spend if to split it into 2? Just to actually physically send 2 boxes, yes, but once you get an accessorial charge on an oversized box, then it doesn't matter, right? So your 2 boxes are cheaper than the one oversized box that gets tacked with the accessorial.
100%. I'd rather take 2 delivery area surcharges rather than one large package or unauthorized oversized charge, which are quite expensive for those that don't know. There's some boutiques, and sometimes presentation is key to how a brand distinguishes itself as maybe luxury or something.
Sure.
But how are some of your customers using packaging as a competitive advantage?
Yeah. I think there's a couple things, right? Doesn't matter how pretty your box looks if something ends up on the customer's doorstep damaged, right? So right sizing, when if you just think about this from a physics perspective, the larger the box is compared to the item that is inside it, the more this thing can move around, right? And you're putting it onto a truck that's vibrating, bouncing, you're going over, all sorts of bumps, speed bumps, normal bumps, everything, right? So and not to mention that, these things get moved quickly. FedEx and UPS, they aren't, casually dropping these boxes from one place to the next, right? So I would say that that's one, right? Is that, what matters to the customer is that the product gets there safe and that they don't need to send it back, because they're already going to send back 30% of their other items, right? For, because they wanted to order 5 shoes and, get grab the one color that they liked or whatever.
Man, I think I need to create like a closet auditing software for my house because you're preaching to me right now. There's all these things, and unfortunately, most of them don't get returned. They end up getting donated when I discover them.
Yeah. So, it's like if you can cut into that a little bit, like it's just really killing a lot of, the reverse logistics stuff is killing a lot of companies, right? Where they are throwing things out, right? You're not the only one that's throwing things out, because sometimes it's cheaper to throw it away than it is to take it back into inventory, get it back on your shelves. Maybe it's not in the original packaging, but customers still care about that kind of thing. They care about the presentation, right? So I think the next is just like offering overall like faster delivery, right? If you're tying in like some of our more automated equipment and you're investing in other automation, then you can hit your 2-day, right? And you can hit that consistently. So you're not delaying orders to your customers. You're able to get things, and most of the large enterprises that we've got, they can reach anyone in America within 48 hours, right? And if you have old packaging methodology, or it's either the only way to overcome that is with more people. So either you're going to be very expensive to do that, which someone has to absorb those costs, or you just need to give up and just kind of lose and know that that's not going to be like one of the promises that you can keep to your customers, right? Our stuff's going to take 6 or 7 days. It's not going to be there in 2 days. And then what happens? A lot of times they'll go to the quicker one. What if you didn't think about it? It's like there's a reason why 2-day shipping became as popular as it did.
Well, it's a world of instant gratification.
Yes, sir.
I want my stuff and I want it now. I think about the Bernie Sanders meme from a few years ago where he's just sitting there like at, I think, an inauguration, legs crossed, hands on his lap. Like as soon as you hit order, you're just sitting outside like, where's my stuff? I want it now, right?
Yep, that's the thing. Sure.
Well, looking ahead, where do you see packaging heading in maybe the next 5 years? I know it's kind of crazy to try to look ahead that far, but
Sure.
Ballpark.
I see things getting faster, just from the hardware, and technology standpoint, right? I see the things that our partners are doing around us to better tie in our equipment, is very, very cool. I'm personally excited about that. That's what I do at Packsize. But then the other part is that I think, whether or not first off, you have a couple different factors that are really going to drive this thing. Number one, is Gen Z. What they care about is vastly different than what the majority of the American population cares about, right? And they're going to be the ones that will be spending the money, right, in very short order here. And they care about the environment. They care about sustainability. And they will make those decisions on who to buy from and who not to buy from based off of how things come to them, right? So that's one. So if the consumer doesn't get you, then you're likely going to get legislated out of this, right? In 2030 in Europe, there is legislation, it's called PPWR, where if your box is less than 50% full, you can be subject to fines, depending on, other things. So New Jersey has also, passed that bill and is trying to figure out exactly, how to put it into practice. And then there's 6 states that have EPR, which is extended producer responsibility laws, that are just saying you actually own the wake of your company, right? And you own you own how sustainable or not sustainable you are, and you also are subject to regulations and fines, so it's going to be consumer driven. It's going to be, if it's not that, then it's legislative action that's going to force you to move. So you may as well move now, right? Where you can really kind of capitalize on those things, and you can get ahead of your competition, keep your customers satisfied, and kind of keep the man off your back, so to speak.
Well, you hear that, Gen Z folks? We're listening. We're hearing what you want, and we're working towards it. What are, I guess, one of the final questions here maybe is like, what innovations are you, most excited about?
Sure. I think there's a lot of cool things going on in like the paper bagging industry, right? So we've also just partnered with a company called Sitma. They are very experienced Italian company that's been around, and I think close to 100 years.
Wow.
And with them, it's a high-speed paper bagging, right? So that's
Okay.
always kind of been the struggle, is that you can move very quick with poly bags. That's why they've been, very successful. But doing it with paper is a little bit different environment. Not to mention that they've kind of needed to, mess with different formulations, see what can withstand the partial shipping environment. But very excited about those things. Things just really kind of what's happening. In the on-demand packaging space, I think, we've got a piece of equipment that we released called the X6, that can move at 1,800 cartons an hour, right? So it just makes it a lot easier for you to, be able to place, when it used to be three pieces of equipment, you can replace one as long as you can get the boxes out of there fast enough to where they need to go. You could do a little 3-for-1 swap there, which is good, and it's not 3 times the cost either.
Sure.
So some exciting things there, but overall, just a general kind of, I think that the market itself is just embracing on-demand packaging. We see that, and we've seen the excitement. We felt it on the trade show floors. We felt it in industry publications. We felt it in a lot of ways. Like, it's just much more front of mind than I think it really ever has been. And that's not a culmination of just the work that Packsize has done, but it's others, like our competitors too, that are pushing everyone, in this direction. I think that, it's an easy thing to solve, and the implementations aren't too difficult.
Well, and it's a necessary thing.
Yeah.
And it's one that, oftentimes goes, it's almost like a thankless solution, right? Like, to your average person, they're putting no thought towards it for the most part whatsoever. Everything that goes into, creating these solutions that you all are driving. It's exciting. You mentioned this, the trade show floors and everything. They're always bustling. I'm always like amazed every time I see, what you guys have next each year, as you're kind of pushing the limits. Cameron, this has been awesome. Every time I get a chance to talk to you guys, I learn something new. In this case, I've probably learned a lot more than something, probably a lot of somethings. But before we let you go, what's one piece of advice you'd give supply chain leaders or e-commerce brands looking to, rethink their packaging strategy?
Yeah. I would say take the time to do an investigation. It is not hard, right? There's, at least like, understanding what the financial impact is, or understanding kind of what you could not be doing from a sustainability aspect. It's very easy. If we get the right data, it takes us less than 24 hours to turn around like what those initial impacts are, right? So it's very directional. I know that Sifted has great products, right, where you guys can also take information in from the customer and really be able to turn around some actionable intelligence in a relatively short amount of time. So, you're not going to, at least for your initial kind of exploration, you're not going to need to assign an entire team, right? You can trust people that, are putting this data together, and then you also trust that, we're going to tell you when we're not a fit. The data it will tell you. It will tell you what your fill rate is. It will tell you if we can reduce the number of cartons necessary. It'll tell you what your material savings. It's math. Like, it's not, it's not hard, and we can go as shallow or kind of as deep into that information as you want, as can Sifted.
Cameron, again, thank you so much. And for folks that want to learn more about Packsize, like, where should they go? Pretty
easy, packsize.com. Look up in the top right-hand side if you want to do that evaluation that I was talking about. If not, you can find videos strewn around the warehouse. Also, go to our YouTube channel. You can check out some of our things in action, and you can also see customer spotlights and see various different industries that we've impacted over the years. So, a nice library there.
Excellent. We'll make sure to drop a few links in our show notes below. Cameron, thanks for joining us today.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Appreciate the opportunity.
That was Cameron Stout from Packsize. Smart packaging, as it turns out, isn't just about going green. It's about going lean. Right sizing can cut labor costs, reduce materials, shrink shipping charges, and even make your warehouse feel a little less Tetris-y. If you want to learn more about Cameron or Packsize, check out the links in our show notes. And if you're looking to rethink more than just your packaging, like carrier mix, cost modeling, or network optimization, come talk to us at Sifted. We help logistics teams make confident, ROI-backed decisions. You can reach me directly at jeremy.lee@sifted.com or just head over to sifted.com. And hey, if you like today's episode, leave us a review or send it to someone who still thinks one size fits all. Again, I'm Jeremy Lee, and this is LeaderShipping. We'll see you next time.